CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Paul Barber.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Face-to-face, President Xi Jinping and Joe Biden hold their first in-person meeting on the sidelines of the G20. The two agree to work on bringing China-US relations back on track.
Egypt calls for faster progress at the COP27 climate talks as big differences remain on emission cuts and finance.
Damage control. Cryptocurrency bosses try to reassure investors after the shock collapse of a major exchange.
And Britain and France sign a new agreement to try to reduce the number of migrants crossing the English Channel in small boats.
We should find the right direction for China-US relations. That's the message from President Xi Jinping to his American counterpart, Joe Biden, as the two held their first face-to-face meeting since Biden became US president.
Meeting on the sidelines of the G20 summit, Xi Jinping said the world is big enough for both countries to prosper together. He also stressed that Taiwan is at the very heart of China's core interests and urged the United States not to cross that red line. Xi Jinping says the current state of bilateral relations is not what the international community wants.
The world expects that China and the U.S. would properly handle their relationship. Our meeting today has attracted the world's highest attention. We should work with all countries to bring more hope to world peace, greater confidence in global stability, and stronger impetus to common development. As always, I am ready to have a candid and in-depth exchange of views with you on issues of strategic importance in China-U.S. relations, global and regional issues. I also look forward to working with you to bring U.S.-China relations back to the track of healthy and stable growth to the benefit of our two countries and the world as a whole.
Speaking after the meeting, President Biden said both sides have agreed that competition between the two countries should not veer into conflict.
We're going to compete vigorously, but I'm not looking for conflict. I'm looking to manage this competition responsibly. And I want to make sure that every country abides by the international rules of the road. And we discussed that. The One China policy, our One China policy has not changed, We oppose unilateral change in the status quo by either side, and we're committed to maintaining the peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits. It was also clear that China and the United States should be able to work together where we can to solve global challenges that require every nation to do its part.
Our correspondent, Sen Wan, is in Bali for us. So, US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan brought bilateral ties to a new low. What did both sides have to say regarding the island?
What you have just mentioned is that President Xi said during the meeting that Taiwan issue is actually the first red line that U.S. should not touch. And he explained that the Taiwan issue is the core interest of Chinese people, and it's also China's internal affair. So U.S. should really stick to and respect the One China policy, as well as the three communique that both sides has agreed on. And President Xi says at the meeting that U.S. should actually stick to its word that it respects such policy, and also reassure that their action is actually comply with what they have promises. And don't forget, this is the first of many of the first time that for the bilateral meeting. What I mean is that this is the first bilateral meeting after Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi headed to Taiwan. So again, President Xi has sent a strong message that this is the first red line that U.S. should not cross. Back to you.
And what about tensions around tariffs and US curbs on technology exports to China? What do we hear about that?
So I want want to refer to what President Xi says at the meeting. He said China does not seek to change the existing international order or interference in the internal affair of the United States and has no intentions to challenge or displace the United States. So this is saying that China is opposed using economy as well as finance tool to increase conflict. Instead, President Xi said both sides should come to the table and also actually work on those differences, as these two countries has different political system as well as different type of democracy mentioned at the meeting, the American style democracy as well as the Chinese style democracy. And this is also has come to what we just mentioned, the trade issue. So President Xi says China is against using it and political size trade, and also this is against the interests of both sides. So they are both leaders agree to remain opening channel of talks on trade, economic, as well as people-to-people exchange to facilitate growth of and meet the needs of the development of both countries. Back to you.
So, Yuan, what did each side have to say about the crisis currently ongoing in Ukraine?
So the tension is definitely on the Russia and Ukraine conflict. And President Xi says China has always been the peace talk promoter. All sides should come to the table to resolve such issues. What he means by that is that President Xi says the US side and also the EU and also NATO should talk to Russia and also promote the opportunity for both sides to come to the table and resolve all the differences through dialogue. Back to you.
Chen Zhe-Yuan, live at the G20 summit in Bali. Many thanks.
Professor Liu Baocheng is the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. I asked him how the relationship between China and the United States could look in the future.
Well, I think all of us recognize that the China-U.S. relationship has been fractured substantially over the years. And now this is really the first time for them to have the face-to-face discussion at the G20. It is a very crucial time for them to really enhance a better understanding, and so that there can be some consensus that can be built over regional and global issues, and also on the macroeconomic issues that both countries can work together. Because after the trade war, people realize that it's going to damage on both sides, and also it's going to endanger the global economy and supply chain. So now I think both leaders are there to reflect what has been really achieved and what is really the constructive relationship that can be fostered. So, differences are there, but how we can really place the guardrails to prevent further escalation and prevent the confrontation. So I think this is really a wonderful chance to not only to ensure that both sides are able to have the synchronization in defending the stability and peace in Asian-Pacific region, but also send a pacifying signal to the rest of the global community.
And let's talk about the global economy for a moment. How important do you think a strong China-US trade relationship is for that?
Well, China and the U.S. has maintained actually a very strong economic ties in spite of some of the political rhetorics against the interdependence. It is there. It is really the households of Americans who benefit from Made in China, and it is also the Chinese companies who benefit by working with peers and partners within the United States. And now, when the global supply chain is under restructuring, and both sides needs really to see eye to eye that a healthy supply chain, instead of bigger the neighbor over the Pacific, can really benefit the individuals of those two nations, and also benefit the global community, and also give more confidence to more of the developing countries, so that they will be able to join the division of labor on global basis. And so how we can really work out to prevent the further protectionist policies of those countries, and whether the U.S. is going to really relax some of the punitive tariffs over Chinese exports. So that's something that remains to be seen.
The war in Ukraine, the COVID pandemic, and a bleak global economic outlook, these are just some of the issues that G20 leaders will try to tackle together as they kick off their annual summit in Bali on Tuesday. CGTN asked the host, Indonesian President Joko Widodo, about his expectations.
The G20 is a group of major world powers. It has enormous influence. We are together facing many problems now. The crisis must be overcome, and the global economy must recover as soon as possible. We must be well prepared. So the G20 summit must produce concrete results, complete practical tasks, and have a real impact on the world. We should avoid empty talks, and instead focus on cooperation to create a better future. The current financial crisis, energy crisis, and the food crisis are intertwined. And we should deal with them together, not alone.
Still ahead on Global Business Europe. Overworked but overpaid. Elon Musk is forced to defend his Tesla pay packet in court as he complains he has too much work on his plate.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and the bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliette Mann.
Welcome back. Just a reminder for you that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
The COP27 climate talks have entered their final week in Egypt, but with big differences still remaining on key issues.
Monday is designated as Water Day at the conference in Sharm el-Sheikh. But tensions have been rising over the lack of progress on the core questions of reducing emissions and finance. COP27's Egyptian president urged delegates to move faster.
I have been informed by Tosi and Marianne that parties need more time to finalize issues regarding mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, agriculture, gender and response measures. In order to ensure an orderly closure of the conference on Friday, 18th of November, I expect very few issues to remain open by the evening of Wednesday, 16th of November, when near final texts will be presented.
Live now to Sharm el-Sheikh and CGTN correspondent Yasser Hakim. Good to see you, Yasser. So a lot of delegates from countries in the south complaining about the lack of progress on issues of loss and damage, which was one of their main demands at the start of this COP27. What's going on with that?
Yes, Paul, the beginning of the COP was something of an optimistic start because of including or introducing the COP, the losses and damage to the agenda of COP27 for the first time. However, till now, there's nothing concrete on the ground that shows that this has been put into action. There's a lot of issues there about trying to get developed countries to commit to the losses and damages. We have countries giving only their own individual loans, grants, and so forth, but they do not want to commit on a mechanism that is stable and ongoing for a longer time. And this is the problem between both sides. Even when I spoke to the EU envoy on climate change, I asked him specifically, are you going to commit? And he said, he didn't answer directly, he just said that we support discussing this. And that question was halfway through the COP27. So after 7 days, he's still saying that we are still encouraging discussions on this. So how long these discussions will take? When will we see an action on the ground? So this is the main issue for developing nations, trying to work with the developed states. Even today there was a session led by China, or organized by China. It's called the South-South Cooperation for developing nations on climate. And this is just an example of how now the South is saying that let's work together and try to have a united front. And it had a lot of backing, it had a lot of demand on this session, which tried to put pressure on the North to try to find some kind of a win-win situation on both sides. And even the UN has worked on answering these questions through the Undersecretary Simon Steele, who said that there is a new initiative that's been launched a few days ago and will be in cooperation with China, which is a $3.1 billion initiative by the UN for early warning systems for catastrophic events led by climate change. Developing nations, the mortality rate for developing nations in hazardous situations current by climate change is 8 times developed states, because there is no early warning systems enough in these areas. So this is just one issue that is related to this. So yes, there are still a lot to be done in the next 7 days, hoping that these issues would be put on the table and we find some kind of a final solution, because back to it, it's in Africa, a developing nation. This COP27 is called the COP of implementation. So will this happen at the end or not will remain to be seen in the next few days. Back to you, Paul.
Yasser Hakim, live from Sharm el-Sheikh at the COP27 summit. Thank you very much indeed.
The World Meteorological Organization is warning that Asia is particularly at risk from severe weather and water stress. It says last year these cost the region $35 billion and affected 50 million people. Elena Menenkova is Deputy Secretary General of the WMO. I asked her whether the key goal of limiting the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius was likely to be met at COP.
I guess we were extremely enthusiastic about having 1.5 in Paris Agreement, and WMO contributed much to have this in the agreement from original 2 degrees. At that time, the window was broader, but now the window is closing. Very recent report of UNEP about emissions said that emission cuts are clearly not enough. WMO report on the global concentrations of greenhouse gases says that we are still racing towards a new record. It's 415 CO2, and methane is growing faster than ever before. So that's a special feature of our report. We cannot explain the reason, but we see methane concentrations are going higher and higher. And our IPCC just said that we are not just on track to 1.5, but the window is becoming narrow. And unless immediate and deep emission reduction happens, then 1.5 might be beyond reach.
So you say immediate, deep action needs to happen now. What should that consist of, do you think?
It's still, according to the IPCC scenarios, it still remains that in order for us to still get to 1.5, the emissions should peak before 2025, and then a reduction should be 43% from 19 level by 2030. Methane could be reduced by 1/3, and by 2050 we should all become zero net.
And how likely is it, do you think, that any agreement is going to be made over this? Of course, there's been lots of talking already so far at COP27. Are we moving in a direction that some concrete decisions might be made?
There is another side of the coin in this whole agreement. It's adaptation and impacts and vulnerability of people. When WMO report indicates impacts which we see and the impacts which people face, this is becoming more motivating for countries and for parties to look at the complex of measures seriously. For instance, we keep saying that last 50 years, number of disasters which hit people increased 5-fold, and they are continuing to grow because with the warming climate change, disasters are becoming more frequent and more intense and often very complex and cascading.
And one area that's been particularly affected so far is Asia. Why has that been a place where the changing climate has had such a severe effect?
In fact, it's important to say that WMO releases annual reports for more than 30 years, and it's only recently we started zooming in the regions because there are specifics. Continent is different from other continents, and it was exactly today when we released specific report just about Asia to indicate what are differences in how Asia is distinct from the mean global situation. In Asia, in particular, the average warming above pre-industrial is 144, which is higher than global average, of course, because also Asia has big polar areas, and Arctic is hitting 5 times or sometimes 6 times faster and higher than the global average. In Asia, sea level rise is much higher in many places than global average, which is already high enough. And in Asia, one of the most important third pole glaciers are melting with unprecedented speed and create a lot of troubles to the people downstream.
Cryptocurrency exchanges are rushing to prevent the virtual equivalent of a run on the banks following the sudden collapse of one of the biggest exchanges, FTX, last week.
Earlier, the boss of Crypto.com, one of the industry's major players, insisted his firm's balance sheet remains strong as he held a question and answer session with investors. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent, John Terrett, who's in New York. So, John, everybody now is looking at Crypto.com.
Yes. I know, Paul and Robin, this is so confusing. But luckily, you have me to explain it to you. Look, the basic problem is that there is a gnawing worry in the back of all our minds now that this crypto thing is going completely wrong. And that, in particular, these exchanges, which Crypto.com is one of, based in Singapore, are actually, when push comes to shove, if you actually wanted to get all your money out, you couldn't because they're insolvent. That's the basic worry. Now, within the past few hours, a man called Chris Marshallak, who's the CEO of Crypto.com, has come out and said, look, here's what happened. Basically, $400 million worth of Ether, which is the second biggest cryptocurrency coin on the Ethereum blockchain network, was transferred from us to a third party. The third party does have a name, but I haven't heard it before, so I'm not going to mention it now. But the point is, he's admitting this money was transferred to a third party in October, kind of accidentally. Oops, sorry about that, he said. But the good news is that the $400 million is now back in the appropriate wallet. That's what they call these things in cryptocurrency. So the money, $400 million, went and has now come back. And the problem is that people who are very clever with these things, who know how to look at the blockchain and analyze it, did so over the last couple of days and saw that this $400 million had gone, and it produced a run on the Crypto.com bank, as it were, just like we saw with FTX last week. Now, he says it was a mistake. Their procedures have been tightened up. It won't happen again. He's terribly sorry, all that kind of stuff. And I do have to tell you that these so-called whale movements, that's what they call them in the world of crypto, a whale movement where a huge amount of dollars is transferred in crypto form from one place to another. They do happen really quite frequently, much more so than you might imagine. But the problem is, of course, in the light of FTX going bankrupt last week, which is effectively what's happened, a movement like that, when discovered over the weekend, looked particularly sketchy and shady. And that's the problem. That's why he had to come out today and say, look, we did make a mistake, terribly sorry, but all is okay now. The rest of the world breathing a sigh of relief, hoping that he's right, that it is going to be okay. In the meantime, Bitcoin, which is the leading cryptocurrency coin, has been hammered again today and is now down 16,500 again. Robin and Paul?
So, John, FTX has effectively gone bankrupt. What's the latest on that?
Well, the disgraced businessman Sam Bankman-Fried, who is the face of cryptocurrency in America, a man who donates millions of dollars to the Democratic Party, a man who spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., advising the government there on how cryptocurrency should be handled in the future, what it means, what it is, how it should be regulated. A man who has divided the cryptocurrency world completely between people who think he's gone too far down the road of regulation and in favor of the government, and others who think that he's so much of a wild card. I mean, nobody doesn't have an opinion on Sam Bankman-Fried. He is reported to be hiding out in the Bahamas. Now, that's where FTX International, the division that we're talking about here, is based. He is at this moment dialing for dollars, which means he's calling people and saying, look, do you remember me? It's Sam Bankman-Fried. And then he's having the phone down put on him time and time again. No one wants to know. He's facing criminal charges from the U.S. Department of Justice right now. The criminal charge most likely that he's facing is wire fraud, electronic transfer of assets. Now, if the DOJ goes down that route, then they're going to have to charge, if they charge him, they'll have to charge all the staff at FTX. Proving criminal intent, however, is very difficult, because was it criminal intent, the fact that they moved that money from one of their companies to another one, or was it just simply being plain old dumb? You know, so we're going to have to wait and see how all this plays out. Meanwhile, finally, the Chinese-backed cryptocurrency exchange called Binance, which you remember last week tried to step in and save FTX and then had to walk away saying, I'm sorry, the hole in this company is just too big, we can't handle this. They're back in the agenda today. Their leader, CZ, who's a Chinese and Canadian businessman, he's set up a fund to help all struggling cryptocurrencies. So there will be a fund there now to help them if they run into trouble. However, the auditing process to get into that is going to be extraordinary, and I'm not sure that many cryptocurrencies firms want to allow themselves to be audited to that extent, because the whole point of cryptocurrency, if you remember, is that it's sort of, you know, free for all. It's kind of unpoliced. There's no oversight. That's the whole point of it. And this is now crumbling before our eyes, and regulation is very much on the horizon. And so I think the crypto experiment won't go away, but it's certainly been put back thanks to FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried.
John, thank you very much. Our correspondent John Terrett in New York.
Sri Lanka has unveiled a new budget which aims to put the nation's finances in order after months of crisis. The budget also includes reforms aimed at restructuring debt, increasing revenues and cutting spending, as it seeks to secure a $2.9 billion bailout from the International Monetary Fund. With the economy predicted to shrink 8.3% this year, the government says the budget presents a political and economic way forward.
UK retail magnate Mike Ashley is in talks to buy the Savile Row tailor Jeeves & Hawkes. Ashley, who's best known as the owner of the discount sportswear chain Sports Direct, is said to be close to agreeing a deal for the iconic menswear maker. Jeeves & Hawkes, which has made suits for royalty and pop stars alike, was put up for sale earlier this year after its Hong Kong-based owner went bankrupt.
Reforms to China's property sector boosted stock markets on Monday after Beijing announced measures that include extending loans for distressed developers. The central bank, along with the banking regulator, issued a 16-point set of directives to promote what it called stable and healthy development of the sector. It's been hit by pandemic lockdowns and lending curbs on developers.
Marvel's latest superhero movie, Wakanda Forever, has set a new box office record in its debut at the weekend. Black Panther sequel earned $118 million, the biggest ever November opening in the United States, and the second biggest debut of the year. The film, which has received good reviews, generated $330 million in box office receipts worldwide.
Now, he's a self-professed workaholic and CEO of no less than 5 major companies.
And now the richest man ever, Elon Musk, has admitted that he has too much work on his plate. He told a business forum on the sidelines of the G20, known as the B20, that he's working the most amount he can 7 days a week, and it's just not something I'd recommend.
And if you're wondering about why he's appearing lit by candlelight, it's because apparently the place he was speaking from had just lost power.
Well, he may be complaining that he's overworked, but others are complaining that he's overpaid. Adding to all that work, Elon Musk is expected to take the stand in court this week to defend his $56 billion Tesla pay package.
Yes, the case has been brought by a shareholder who accuses him of linking his pay to easy performance targets and says that investors were duped into approving it. Earlier, I spoke to Anne Lipton, who's a former corporate litigator, now a professor at Tulane Law School, and I began by asking her what's at stake for Musk and Tesla.
Well, I mean, the plaintiffs are arguing that his pay package since 2018 was unjustified and unfairly awarded. So what they're asking for is that he forfeit a lot of the stock that he's been awarded since 2018, which is quite valuable, running the multi-billions of dollars if plaintiffs were to prevail and get the remedy that they seek. So theoretically, quite a bit is at stake.
And how much of a case do you think that this shareholder has in bringing this case? Corporate boards have pretty wide latitude to set executive compensation, don't they? And Tesla's directors say that Elon Musk did fulfill their goals. He drove up the stock tenfold.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think that the plaintiffs have sort of a tough mountain to climb here. The only reason this case even got past the motion to dismiss, because exactly as you say, boards have that discretion to set pay, is because this particular board happens to have very close ties to Elon Musk. I mean, his brother is on the board. Many of the board members have long-standing business and social ties with him. And that allowed the plaintiffs to argue that Elon Musk essentially controlled their behavior. Tesla tried to have the shareholders approve the pay package so it could avoid precisely this situation. And the shareholders did vote in favor of it, but the plaintiffs argue that they were not given sufficient disclosures when making that vote. So as a result, this whole thing's going to trial, but the default position would normally be board set CEO compensation. If shareholders don't like it, they can vote for a new board of directors. So the plaintiffs are going to have an uphill battle.
Now, you've been a corporate litigator and you've handled class actions involving some of the world's biggest companies. Are these kinds of legal cases unusual, or do shareholders often not challenge pay of CEOs?
They don't. They don't challenge CEO pay at all, because usually boards go at it. Elon Musk is unusual in that he stocked the board of a public company with a lot of his close friends and allies. That you see on private companies, certainly, but public companies usually do a better job of putting directors on the board who are sort of independent of the CEO, and that help create, in appearance, if not in fact, some degree of objectivity in setting pay packages. But it's precisely this conflict of interest, the fact that Elon Musk is so close to so many board members, that got this case as far as it did.
And how do you think this could impact the Tesla board in the long term? Could it lead to another shake-up?
I mean, it might. I mean, the thing is that, again, it's not clear that the plaintiffs are going to prevail at all. It's really more that because of the closeness of the board to Elon Musk, and Musk's, shall we say, unconventional behavior in public, there's a line of shareholder lawsuits coming down the pike. Other shareholders who are alleging that in various ways the board has failed to oversee Musk appropriately. And so you just wonder whether at some point the legal trouble is going to be such that shareholders demand, some kind of real independence of board members when they decide that, Musk's eccentricities are probably not worth the trouble that he's causing.
Coming up on CGTN, arrests after Sunday's deadly explosion in Istanbul. The Kurdish militants deny responsibility.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, in the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
And welcome back to Global Business Europe with Robin Dwyer and Paul Barber. The headlines again. China's president arrives in Bali, where leaders from the world's 20 largest economies are gathering for their annual summit.
Face-to-face, President Xi Jinping and Joe Biden hold their first in-person meeting on the sidelines of the G20 to agree to work on bringing China-US relations back on track.
And Egypt calls for faster progress at the COP27 climate talks, and big differences remain on emission cuts and finance.
Britain and France have signed a new agreement aimed at trying to stop people cross the English Channel in small boats.
The UK's Interior Minister joined her French counterpart in Paris to sign a $75 million deal. Our correspondent Michael Voss reports.
So far this year, more than 40,000 migrants have made the dangerous illegal crossing in small rubber dinghies from the coast of France. 2 years ago, less than 10,000 came this way. Successive Conservative Party leaders have been under intense pressure to stem the flow, made more complicated by the UK's strained relationship with France post-Brexit. But that now could be on the mend as Britain's Interior Minister, Suella Braverman, travelled to Paris on Monday morning to renew and update an existing agreement with France's Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin.
Well, we need to significantly reduce the numbers of people crossing the Channel. The Prime Minister has been absolutely clear. I've been absolutely clear that illegal migration, particularly in the numbers that we've been seeing more recently, is totally unacceptable. And that's why I'm really pleased to have been in Paris today to be signing a new cooperation agreement with the French to tackle this problem.
Britain will pay France $75 million, 10 million more than the previous agreement. This will allow an additional 100 gendarmes to patrol the French beaches, bringing the total to 300 police. British officers will now be embedded in French control rooms and on the ground to help improve coordination. The agreement will also pay for extra surveillance technology, including drones. The move could make the job of the people smuggling gangs more difficult, but it doesn't address what's happening to migrants once they arrive in Britain. There's now a backlog of more than 100,000 asylum applications. Last year, only 4% of applications were processed. Just weeks ago, the government faced criticism for allowing severe overcrowding at the Manston Processing Centre in Kent. 4,000 people, including children, were crammed into a facility meant for 1,600 and were staying weeks instead of days. The deal could have been signed months ago, but the French put it on hold, waiting for a stable government in Britain. Now observers are waiting to see whether this marks the first step in an improved relationship with France. Michael Voss, CGTN.
Well, our correspondent Ross Cullen is in Paris. So, Ross, how is this deal being seen in France?
Hi, Robin. Gerald Darmanin, all smiles this morning at that breakfast meeting with Suella Braverman, the two interior ministers meeting in the opulent Place Beauvau, the French interior minister, to sign that document. $75 million cash coming from London to Paris to try to encourage the French to step up patrols this side on French soil to try to cut the number of people coming in small boats from France to the United Kingdom. The French have often said that these people don't want to be in France, they want to be in the United Kingdom. That is their ultimate destination, and they are just transiting through France, but they are going to be doing more surveillance work, more checks now as a result of this agreement. I don't think that Gerald Darmanin might have been using the kind of language that Suella Braverman has been using recently. We know that she has described what's happening in Britain with the number of people coming to UK from France as an invasion. And that is language that the French are unlikely to be using at that kind of level, but she has managed to score a success in getting this deal signed. As you mentioned, the French perhaps were ready to work with Prime Minister Liz Truss before and during her 6-week tenure, and then there was more instability across the Channel, and now there's another Prime Minister in place, and as Michael Voss was alluding to there, the French now able to press ahead with that deal now that there is more stability across the Channel.
So, Ross, what impact is this deal likely to have on the somewhat strained relations between Paris and London?
Certainly a budding bromance between Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, and Emmanuel Macron, the French President. The two men do see eye to eye on a number of issues. Both countries permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, and they are aligned on continuing to support Ukraine to fight off the ongoing invasion of its territory by Russia. They are aligned as well on needing to step up on the climate emergency and try to protect biodiversity. There has been disaccord in recent months and recent years, you're right, during the tenures of some of the recent Prime Ministers the United Kingdom has had, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, particularly over Brexit. With the implementation of the Brexit agreement, thousands of Britons coming to France are now coming into the European Union from outside the EU, needing to go through much more stringent checks, passport control, for example. So there's been discord over that, and over the issue of migrants in the Channel as well. But with Suella Braverman here in Paris this morning, meeting with her counterpart, and the two men at the top of the governments here in France and in the United Kingdom, both the members of the G7, those big economies, both of them now going to Indonesia, Mr Sunak and Mr Macron. There will be further chance for further talks between the two men. Darmanin and Braverman have met, so that it does seem to signal an improvement in relations between France and the United Kingdom.
Ross, thank you for that. Our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris.
Police have arrested a female suspect they believe may have planted the explosives that went off in the centre of Istanbul.
6 people died and 81 were injured when the blast hit the busy Istiklal shopping district on Sunday afternoon. The Turkish Interior Minister says initial signs are that Kurdish militants may have been behind the attack.
Well, let's get more details now from our correspondent Louise Greenwood in the newsroom. Louise, what more do we know about the arrest?
Well, Paul, they come after a series of house raids on the European side of Istanbul in the early hours of Monday. Now, the authorities say a woman has been arrested. She's a Syrian national named Alham al-Bashir. In addition, a further 21 people have been taken into custody. Now, after questioning by officers, police say that this woman claims that she was trained by Kurdish militants in Syria and then entered into Turkey through the northwest Syria's Afrin region. Pictures of her have been released, no charges at present. Now, looking back at that security footage from the scene of the attack, it shows a woman in Islamic dress, in the hijab, sitting on a bench for around 40 minutes just before the blast, getting up and apparently leaving a bag behind her. Now, the explosive was left in a place where it could cause absolute maximum damage. This was the centre of the main Istiklal shopping centre on a Sunday afternoon, full of shoppers, families at the weekend, a very popular place for Turkish people to go. In terms of the actual victims, we do now know that the number of dead has risen to 6. Over 80 people are injured, some of them seriously, many of them being treated in local hospitals, receiving blood transfusions. And it's now known that a 3-year-old girl and her father and 2 other young girls were among those who lost their lives when this blast occurred.
And Louise, concerning who may be responsible, the ruling AK party seems to be pointing the finger at the Kurdish PKK.
Well, this comes from Turkey's Interior Minister, Süleyman Soylu. He paid a visit to the scene of the attack on Monday, and he said that the initial signs are that this was an attack by PKK rebels. This is the armed wing of the Kurdistan Workers' Party who's held this 40-year insurgency against the state in Turkey. It's a designated terrorist organisation in the US and in the EU. That said, both the PKK and its Syrian opposite, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, have denied any knowledge of this attack at all. The PKK on Twitter said earlier that it has no involvement, and that, it says, is despite those being arrested being mostly Kurdish or Syrian citizens. Now, the other claim that's being made by Süleyman Soylu is that this unit that may have been behind this attack was based in the town of Kobani on the Syrian border. Now, to give you some context on this, Kobani has been at the absolute heart of the dispute between the Kurds in Turkey and the AKP government under President Erdogan since the height of the Syrian conflict. Cast your mind back to 2015. This is when the region fell to Islamic State fighters. The AKP government at the time imposed a blockade on the town, preventing the shipment of arms and support to the mainly YPG fighters who liberated Kobani after a 4-month siege. Now, the AKP has always maintained its position towards Kobani was to contain what it saw as being terrorist elements operating within the region. Now, in terms of the Istanbul attack, at present, no one group's come forward or claimed responsibility. The authorities are still, however, not ruling out that this may have been another attack on the city by Islamic State fighters. They've killed many times before, both right across Turkey and in Istanbul itself.
Louise, how significant is the timing of this attack?
Well, it's absolutely crucial, Paul. We're into a pre-election period now in Turkey, the run-up to the 2023 presidential and parliamentary elections. They are provisionally due to take place in June of next year. The AKP, as we know, under pressure now as never before. We've had this terrible economic crisis in the country, the near collapse of the lira. Support for the AKP has been falling at the polls. There's really everything to play for opposition groups. Now, the concern among Turkey's residents may be that the country, the republic, could be returning to this campaign of terrorist activity that we last saw back in 2015 to 17 when the Syrian conflict was really at its height. Then we saw hundreds of people right across the country being killed, a series of bombings and attacks, the biggest being that bombing of the peace rally in Ankara that left 95 mainly young people dead. Istanbul particularly exposed. We know for a fact that there are militant Islamist cells operating quite openly in the city, spillover from the war in Syria. All of these groups, whether they're Kurdish, leftist, Islamist groups, they will be looking for absolute maximum exposure in the run-up to these crucial elections when the eyes of the whole world are going to be on Turkey and what happens next with the government.
Indeed. Louise, thanks so much for that analysis. Louise Greenwood.
Ukraine's president has accused Russian soldiers of war crimes and civilian killings in Kherson. Last week, Ukraine's army retook control of large parts of the region, which had been held by Russian troops since March.
Volodymyr Zelensky, on a trip to Kherson, said its liberation is the beginning of the end of the conflict. But he added that investigators have found evidence of hundreds of war crimes.
Let's talk now to our correspondent Giles Gibson, who's in Tallinn. So, Giles, what has Volodymyr Zelensky been saying?
Well, the Ukrainian president is claiming that his officials have discovered evidence of 400 war crimes in the Kherson area, also saying that they have discovered, quotes, the same savagery that they had found in other parts of the country when Russian forces had retreated. Now, the Kremlin has, throughout this conflict, always maintained that its soldiers do not target Ukrainian civilians in any way, but clearly that was a reference there from the Ukrainian president to places such as Bucha, where mass graves have been discovered once Russian forces have been forced to withdraw from those areas. Volodymyr Zelensky, as you mentioned, really cast this recapture of Kherson, this key city as a bit of a turning point in this war, but there were also moments during his visit where it was still very clear that there is a long way to go in terms of the Ukrainians claiming any sort of a victory in this conflict. Just moments before he addressed some soldiers in the main central square in Kherson, there was shelling reported in the sort of surrounding area, that you could hear shelling going on. And we've also been hearing reports over the last 24 hours or so that there is some very intense fighting in the east of the country, in the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. Very heavy fighting going on along the front lines there too.
And reports too, Giles, that Russian and US officials have been holding talks in Ankara.
That's right. A White House official who asked to remain anonymous has said that William Burns, who is the director of the CIA, has travelled to Ankara, the Turkish capital, to meet with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Narishkin. He is the director of the Foreign Intelligence Service inside Russia. This anonymous official at the White House saying that the two men have discussed not escalating this war any further in terms of the use of nuclear weapons, as well as US prisoners who are currently being held inside Russia, although they also stressed that there were no negotiations, no talks about any sort of a peace settlement or anything like that in Ukraine. The spokesperson to the Russian President Vladimir Putin, Dmitry Peskov, he has confirmed to Russian media that a meeting did take place in Ankara between US and Russian officials, but hasn't really given any more details about who was there or really what was discussed. Also worth noting that Turkey is very heavily involved in negotiations that have been going on to try to revive or extend this deal that was done by the United Nations to allow grain exports from Ukraine's Black Sea coast. That deal set to expire on Saturday, the 19th of November, and there is now a real push to try to extend it in the next couple of days or so.
Giles, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Giles Gibson.
Stay with us, still ahead. Vive la Révolution will tell you about the meaning behind the newly unveiled Paris 2024 Olympic Games mascots.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw. The cleanup operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back. The energy crisis sparked by the war in Ukraine is pushing many EU countries towards a return to traditional fossil fuels. But Greece is continuing to move towards renewable energy.
That's right. In September, 81% of energy demands were met by renewables, which briefly hit 100% in October. Our correspondent Evangelos Sipsas reports.
New LNG terminals, excavation of coal in western Greece, and a gas pipeline running through the northern part of the country into Bulgaria are just some of the projects that the Greek government decided to accelerate after the war in Ukraine started. But for Greece, turning away from dependency on Russian energy doesn't mean turning away from renewables. The country continues to push for a transition to clean energy and carbon neutrality, with the numbers proving just that.
On October 7th, the country's total electricity demand was covered by renewables for 5 hours. The energy produced from renewable sources has doubled since 2015.
Greece has cultivated a rich variety of renewable energy sources in recent years, from wind, hydro, and solar. The aim, to avoid the use of fossil fuels as much as possible and rely more on a green mix, especially now as gas and oil prices are soaring.
The energy crisis has helped make renewables more popular, and it speeds up the process of transitioning to green energy. But most importantly, the theory of turning to natural gas as a bridge between lignite and renewables has collapsed thanks to the crisis. Now it's a fact that we can turn directly to clean energy from lignite without having to go through gas.
And the numbers reflect just that. In September, renewable energy sources accounted for 39.4% of the country's total energy consumption, leaving natural gas in second place with 32%. Third comes lignite with 10.1%, hydroelectric at 6.9%, and other sources mainly imported from neighboring countries amounted to 11.6%. Greece currently leads the Netherlands, France, Germany, and many other European nations when it comes to the production of renewables. And the government wants that to increase even more. But before being able to, other issues need to be addressed.
In order to use more energy from renewables, we'll have to develop the infrastructure to store clean energy. For example, storage areas with batteries. The big challenge being, when will we have the technology for it, and how fast can we do it? And another challenge is the financial benefit from the transition. Will the local population benefit from it?
Energy subsidies paid from the European Union are helping Greece's transition to clean energy, which is moving at a fast pace, even as the war in Ukraine is making many think twice before turning away from fossil fuels. Evangelos Ipsas for CGTN, Athens.
And finally, the hats, worn as a symbol of the French Revolution, have been unveiled as the official mascots of the 2024 Paris Olympics and Paralympics.
Yes, the squishy red caps will come in two versions, with one for the Paralympics having a running blade on one leg. A spokesman said he hoped the Olympics would also prompt a sports revolution, with people encouraged to add it to their daily lives.
The headlines again. China's president arrives in Bali, where leaders from the world's 20 largest economies are gathering for their annual summit.
Face-to-face, President Xi Jinping and Joe Biden hold their first in-person meeting on the sidelines of the G20. The two agreed to work on bringing China-US relations back on track.
Egypt calls for faster progress at the COP27 climate talks, as big differences remain on emission cuts and finance.
And Britain and France sign a new agreement to try to reduce the number of migrants crossing the English Channel in small boats.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
Yes, thank you. More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, Africa Live, but we'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.